The air over the Nile was still dark when the first kitchen fires began to wake. Far from the great temples and tall stone statues, inside narrow mud-brick homes pressed closely together beside dusty village paths, tiny flames slowly flickered into life. The darkness of the night still rested softly over the land. The river moved quietly nearby, black and smooth beneath the fading stars. Somewhere in the distance, water birds called once and then became silent again. Ancient Egypt was already awake. Not the Egypt of golden masks or painted tombs. Not the Egypt of kings resting beneath mountains of stone. This was the quieter Egypt. The slower Egypt. The Egypt of tired workers rubbing sleep from their eyes before sunrise. The Egypt of bakers, brewers, fishermen, and servants beginning another long day beneath the heavy desert sky. And in nearly every home, before the sun had even appeared above the eastern horizon, the kitchens had already begun to breathe. The smell came first. Warm ashes from yesterday's fire still rested inside clay ovens and shallow cooking pits. When fresh bundles of dry reeds and chopped straw were pushed into the coals, a soft wave of smoke drifted upward through the sleeping rooms. The smoke smelled earthy and dusty. It carried traces of burnt grain and old wood. It settled into clothing, blankets, baskets, and hair. Most homes in ancient Egypt lived with smoke every day. It clung gently to almost everything. Soon another smell slowly joined it. Bread. Not soft bread like the kind many people imagine today, but heavy bread made from coarse grain crushed slowly between stone grinding wheels. Women and servants had often begun grinding grain before dawn. The sound filled the quiet streets in every village beside the Nile. Stone scraping against stone. Slow and steady. Rhythmic enough to sound almost like breathing. Inside the kitchens, the flour mixed with water into thick dough. Sometimes dates or herbs were added. Sometimes the bread remained plain and simple. Hands pressed and folded the dough in dim light while oil lamps flickered against mud walls stained dark from years of smoke. As the bread baked against the hot inner walls of clay ovens, the smell deepened. Nutty grain. Warm ash. Dry earth. Slight bitterness from charred crusts. The kitchens of ancient Egypt rarely smelled sweet. Most of the time they smelled practical. Dense. Heavy. Honest. The people living beside the Nile worked long hours beneath intense heat. Their food needed to fill the stomach slowly. It needed to survive long days in fields and workshops. The smell of baking bread was not comforting in the soft modern way many imagine. It was the smell of survival. The smell of another day beginning. Outside, dawn slowly spread pale blue light over the riverbanks. The streets between homes remained narrow and uneven. Sand gathered in corners. Donkeys shifted lazily beside wooden fences. Thin dogs wandered quietly between baskets and sleeping mats left outdoors during the cooler night hours. A warm breeze carried the scent of river mud from the Nile itself. That smell was always present. Wet mud. Green reeds. Fish. Rotting plants drifting along the river edge. The Nile gave life to Egypt, but it was not a clean smell. It was thick and natural and endlessly alive. Kitchens close to the river absorbed these scents constantly. Fish scales stuck to cutting boards. Damp baskets held water plants. Clay jars sweated in the heat. Even drinking water carried the soft smell of the river inside it. As the morning brightened, kitchens became hotter. The ovens held heat like small suns trapped inside clay walls. Smoke drifted upward toward small ceiling openings, though much of it stayed trapped indoors. Many kitchens had little ventilation. Servants and workers sweated while preparing food long before the strongest heat of the day even arrived. Sweat became another common smell of ancient Egyptian kitchens. Human sweat mixed with flour dust. Sweat mixed with onion skins. Sweat mixed with smoke and fish oil. The scent of labor was everywhere. Many homes prepared onions in the morning because onions lasted well in the heat and could flavor simple meals. Workers often carried onions into the fields beside rough bread and beer. When onions were sliced open inside small kitchens, their sharp scent spread quickly through the rooms. Garlic too. Strong. Bitter. Lingering. Ancient Egyptian kitchens were full of garlic. Its smell stayed on hands, knives, bowls, and breath. Laborers building temples and tombs often ate garlic because people believed it helped strength and endurance. In crowded workers' villages, the smell drifted from house to house long before sunrise. Nearby, large clay jars held beer. Egyptian beer was thick and cloudy, sometimes almost like liquid bread. The smell was sour and grainy. Fermentation filled kitchens with a warm sharpness that blended with smoke and damp clay walls. Even children drank weak beer because river water was not always safe alone. The kitchens breathed constantly. Smoke. Yeast. Ash. Onions. Fish. Warm beer. Wet mud. Human exhaustion. This was the scent of ordinary life beside the Nile thousands of years ago. As the sun climbed higher, kitchens became louder. Wooden bowls scraped across rough tables. Clay pots knocked gently together. Sandals shuffled across packed earth floors. Mothers called softly to children. Workers hurried to eat before leaving for fields, fishing boats, workshops, or massive construction sites. In wealthier homes, servants moved carefully through larger cooking spaces. Their kitchens smelled different in small ways. More herbs. More oil. Sometimes roasted duck or honey. But even rich kitchens still carried smoke. They still carried heat. Ancient Egypt smelled deeply of fire because nearly all food depended on open flames and clay ovens. In the homes of nobles, cooks prepared meals slowly while flies buzzed lazily through warm air. Fresh herbs such as coriander and dill sometimes rested on cutting tables. The smell of crushed herbs briefly brightened the heavy kitchen air before disappearing beneath stronger scents. Honey was precious and sweet, though not common for ordinary workers. When honey warmed inside bowls or dripped over cakes in wealthier homes, kitchens filled with a softer smell that mixed gently with baked grain. But sweetness never lasted long. Soon the smell of fish returned. Fish was everywhere along the Nile. Some fish were cooked fresh. Others were salted and dried beneath the desert sun. Dried fish had an especially powerful smell. Salty. Sharp. Slightly rotten at times. In crowded villages, fish drying racks stood beside homes, and the smell drifted constantly through nearby kitchens. Cats lingered near these places. Ancient Egyptian kitchens often had cats moving silently between shadows and baskets. They hunted mice and rats attracted by grain storage. Their fur sometimes carried dust and ash from sleeping near warm ovens. In the quieter hours of afternoon, cats stretched beside dying cooking fires while kitchens rested briefly from the day's work. By midday, the heat became difficult. The desert sun pressed heavily onto rooftops made from mud and straw. Inside kitchens the air grew thick and slow. Cooking fires added even more warmth. Sweat rolled down faces and necks. Workers moved more slowly now. Even conversations softened. The smell of hot stone and sun-baked clay filled the rooms. Outside, many laborers rested briefly in patches of shade if they could find them. Farmers near the Nile sat beneath palm trees beside irrigation canals. Fishermen repaired nets while flies drifted lazily around baskets of drying fish. And still the kitchens continued. Some women prepared lentils slowly in clay pots. The smell of simmering lentils was earthy and soft. Sometimes cumin or herbs were added. Sometimes only salt. Clay pots darkened with soot after years beside open flames. Their surfaces held old cooking smells permanently trapped inside the porous clay itself. Many kitchens smelled ancient even then. Smoke from countless meals had soaked into walls for generations. Oil darkened ceiling beams. Grain dust rested in corners. The scent of old fires never fully disappeared. In poorer homes, animals sometimes lived very close to cooking areas. Goats wandered near entrances. Chickens pecked beside baskets of reeds. Their smells blended naturally into daily life. Feathers, dung, straw, and dust became part of the atmosphere surrounding food preparation. Nothing in these kitchens felt separate from the outside world. The Nile entered the homes through water jars. The desert entered through drifting sand. Animals entered through open doorways. Smoke escaped slowly into the sky and settled back onto the village again. As afternoon slowly faded toward evening, another wave of cooking began. Workers returned home tired and coated with dust. Men who had spent the day cutting stone or digging irrigation trenches carried the smell of sun and sweat back into the narrow streets. Their skin smelled dry from heat. Their clothes smelled of earth and river mud. Evening kitchens became crowded again. The fires burned brighter now against the darkening sky. Shadows moved across walls in warm orange light. Families gathered close together while food cooked slowly nearby. Many meals remained simple. Bread, beer, onions, beans, fish. Sometimes figs or dates. Sometimes duck or goat during special occasions. The smells deepened beautifully in the cooler evening air. Smoke drifted upward into dark blue skies where stars slowly appeared above Egypt once again. The scent of roasted fish mixed with river breeze. Fresh bread cracked softly beside cooking fires. Oil lamps flickered gently while insects hummed outside the homes. Children grew sleepy beside the warmth. Older workers stretched tired legs after long labor beneath the sun. Some kitchens became quieter now. Others remained busy far into the night. Large bakeries near cities continued working after dark. Public kitchens preparing food for labor crews sometimes operated late beside temple grounds or royal building projects. The smell of mass baking spread heavily through surrounding streets. Thousands of loaves. Endless grain. Constant heat. Ancient Egyptian cities likely smelled deeply of bread nearly every hour of the day. In worker villages near tomb construction sites, kitchens never fully rested either. Crews building royal tombs depended on enormous food supplies. Bakers, brewers, and cooks labored continuously behind the scenes. Their work rarely appeared in painted carvings, yet their smells filled the air surrounding every great project. Even at night, the kitchens still breathed softly. The fires cooled slowly. Ash settled quietly. Clay walls released stored heat into the darkness. And beneath the distant stars of ancient Egypt, the smell of bread and smoke lingered over the Nile like a living memory that refused to fade. The night air beside the Nile carried sound differently after sunset. During the hottest hours of the day, noise often rose sharply from crowded streets and busy workshops. Men shouted across riverbanks. Donkeys brayed beside narrow paths, hammers struck stone beneath the burning sun. But at night, the sound softened. Voices became quieter. Footsteps slowed. The world seemed to breathe more gently beneath the stars. And still, from many homes, the kitchens remained awake. A low orange glow flickered behind small doorways cut into mud brick walls. Smoke drifted lazily upward into the warm darkness. Some families prepared food late because the evening air finally allowed cooking without unbearable heat. Others simply had too much work during daylight hours to finish everything before sunset. Inside these kitchens, the smell changed once more. The sharp heat of daytime fires faded into something softer now. Ash cooled slowly beneath clay ovens. Warm grain lingered in the air. Oil lamps burned with a faint smoky scent that mixed with old cooking smells trapped inside the walls. The walls themselves seemed alive with memory. For years, sometimes generations, smoke had darkened the mud bricks. Every meal left something behind. A trace of fish oil, burned herbs, damp grain, melted animal fat. Ancient kitchens absorbed life slowly, layer after layer, until the rooms carried the scent of entire families long after they had fallen asleep. In poorer homes, the kitchen was often not truly separate from where people rested. The same room might hold cooking tools, sleeping mats, baskets of grain, clay jars, sandals, and folded linen all together. Families lived close to their fires because the fire was the center of survival. At night, the smell of warm ash settled gently over sleeping bodies. Children curled beneath woven blankets while embers still glowed faintly nearby. Parents rested beside walls that held the day's remaining heat. Outside, desert wind brushed softly against rooftops made from mud and straw. The kitchens never became fully clean. Tiny traces of food stayed everywhere. Grain dust rested inside cracks along the floor. Onion skins gathered in corners. Fish scales shimmered faintly near cutting stones. Oil soaked into wooden tools. Smoke blackened ceilings year after year. And yet there was comfort in this. Not comfort in the modern sense of softness or freshness, but comfort through familiarity. These smells meant the home was alive. The ovens had worked. Bread had baked. Water jars were filled. Another day beside the Nile had been survived. Far away from royal palaces, ordinary Egyptians understood life through routine more than luxury. Most people woke before sunrise and slept shortly after darkness arrived. Their kitchens followed the same rhythm as the river itself. Slow, steady, endless. Before dawn came again, some workers were already moving through the villages carrying baskets of grain toward communal ovens. The stars still shone overhead. Cool air lingered briefly before the return of heat. Sand felt cold beneath bare feet. The smell of the river was strongest at this hour. Wet reeds, mud, fish drifting near the banks, moist earth left behind after irrigation. Fishermen pushed narrow wooden boats quietly into dark water while kitchens slowly prepared the morning meal behind them. Nets smelled of algae and river plants. Damp rope carried the scent of old fish and muddy water. These odors drifted naturally into nearby homes where cooking fires were beginning again. Some kitchens sat very close to animal pens. Goats shifted restlessly before sunrise. Chickens fluttered softly on wooden perches. Cows breathed heavily in the darkness. Their smells blended into everyday life so completely that few people likely noticed them anymore. Dung burned as fuel in some places where wood was scarce. This gave certain kitchens a dry smoky smell unlike ordinary firewood. Mixed with straw and reeds, the fuel burned slowly beneath clay cooking pots. The scent lingered heavily in enclosed rooms, especially during still mornings when the air barely moved. Women often carried the greatest burden inside these kitchens. Long before the first light touched temple walls or palm trees, many women were already awake grinding grain. The work was exhausting. Kneeling beside stone grinding tools hour after hour slowly damaged backs, knees, shoulders, and hands. Fine grain dust filled the air around them. It settled onto skin and clothing. It coated hair with pale powder. Ancient Egyptian kitchens smelled strongly of flour. Not the clean smell of fresh bakery flour, but coarse crushed grain mixed with dust from stone grinders. Tiny bits of sand sometimes entered the bread during grinding. Over years, this rough texture slowly wore down people's teeth. Many adults in ancient Egypt suffered painful dental problems from the bread they ate every day. But in the quiet dawn kitchens, survival mattered more than comfort. The grinding continued steadily. Stone against stone. Breathing. Fire crackling softly nearby. Outside, the eastern sky slowly became silver. As the villages awakened, kitchen smells drifted outward into narrow streets. One home smelled heavily of garlic. Another smelled of fish stew simmering slowly in clay pots. Another carried only smoke and dry bread because little else remained to cook. Poverty had its own scent. Empty grain jars. Cold ashes. Stale bread kept too long in the heat. Ancient Egypt could be fertile beside the Nile, but life for ordinary workers was still uncertain. Floods sometimes failed. Crops sometimes weakened. Illness sometimes spread through crowded villages. Kitchens reflected these hardships quietly. During difficult seasons, families stretched meals carefully. Thin soup simmered with lentils and onions. Bread became rougher and darker. Fish might be dried longer to prevent waste. Beer became weaker. The smells became sharper too. Sour grain. Old oil. Overheated clay pots. Smoke from cheap fuel. Yet life continued beside the river as it always had. The Nile flooded. The waters withdrew. Seeds were planted. Grain was harvested. And kitchens worked endlessly between these cycles. In wealthier districts near larger cities, food preparation could become more elaborate. Large homes employed servants who spent entire days managing supplies. Storerooms held baskets of figs, jars of honey, oils, spices, and wine. Kitchens smelled richer there. Roasted duck turned slowly above fires. Fresh herbs were crushed into sauces. Dates warmed inside honey mixtures. Leeks and cucumbers rested in cool baskets near water jars. But even these kitchens still carried the familiar scent of smoke-blackened clay and human labor. Ancient cooking required constant physical effort. Fires needed feeding. Water needed carrying. Grain needed grinding. Nothing arrived easily. Servants moved carefully through heat and steam while flies circled overhead. Flies were everywhere in Egypt. Near fish. Near animals. Near bread dough. Near riverbanks. Kitchens spent much of the day buzzing softly with insects drawn by food and warmth. Servants waved them away with tired hands while continuing their work. By midday the flies became slower from heat, just like the workers themselves. The sun above Egypt could feel endless. Light reflected harshly from pale stone walls and dusty roads. Inside kitchens, the temperature climbed steadily. Sweat rolled down backs and necks. Thin linen clothing clung to damp skin. Water jars became precious. The smell of warm clay filled the air. Clay jars. Clay bowls. Clay ovens. Clay walls. The entire kitchen seemed baked by the sun. Water stored in porous clay containers cooled slightly through evaporation. These jars often smelled faintly earthy and damp. When water was poured into cups, the scent of clay mixed gently with the scent of the Nile itself. Workers drank often when possible, though clean water remained difficult to guarantee. Beer therefore stayed important throughout daily life. Weak beer filled stomachs and provided safer hydration than river water alone. Kitchens constantly smelled of brewing grain because beer production happened almost everywhere. Fermentation gave the air a living quality. Warm yeast. Sour grain. Foam rising slowly inside jars. In some homes, beer bubbled quietly beside baking bread, both made from the same precious grain harvested along the fertile riverbanks. Children grew up surrounded by these smells from birth. Their earliest memories were likely shaped by smoke curling upward through morning light, by bread cooling on woven mats, by onions hanging beside walls, by river breeze entering through open doorways carrying mud and fish and damp reeds into the home. Even illness had its smell inside ancient kitchens. In crowded settlements, sickness spread easily. Poor ventilation trapped smoke indoors, damaging lungs over time. Food spoiled quickly in the heat. Waste gathered near living spaces. When fevers came, kitchens sometimes smelled of medicinal herbs crushed carefully into mixtures beside sleeping mats. Priests and healers used oils and plants believed to carry healing powers. Mint, incense, garlic, and resin sometimes filled rooms where the sick rested quietly. The scent of these treatments drifted softly through homes late into the night. Death itself was never very far away in the ancient world. But life continued steadily beside it. Bread still baked. Fish still dried beneath the sun. Families still gathered around evening fires. As darkness returned once more across the Nile Valley, workers slowly came home again. The air cooled slightly. Palm trees whispered softly beside irrigation canals. Boats drifted along dark river water beneath moonlight. And once again, kitchens awakened for the evening meal. The smell of roasting fish spread through villages first. Oil hissed quietly over flames. Fresh bread warmed beside the fires. Lentils simmered slowly while tired families rested nearby after another day of labor. In some homes, conversation remained gentle and quiet. In others, children still laughed sleepily while parents prepared simple meals beneath flickering lamplight. Shadows moved across mud walls stained dark from countless years of smoke. Some workers massaged sore hands after long hours cutting stone or hauling baskets beneath the sun. Others simply sat silently, too exhausted for many words. The kitchens held them all together. Warmth. Food. Firelight. The smell of smoke in linen clothing. The scent of onions cooking slowly beside bread. The faint sweetness of dates shared carefully between family members. And outside, beyond the villages and crowded streets, the great desert remained silent beneath endless stars, while the Nile continued flowing calmly through the darkness beside the sleeping world of ancient Egypt. Long before the first sunlight touched the tops of the palm trees, the bakers were already working again. In the quiet darkness beside the Nile, entire neighborhoods still slept beneath flat mud-brick rooftops. Families rested close together on woven mats while the cooler night air drifted softly through open doorways. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. The river moved slowly beneath the stars, black and calm like polished stone. But inside the bakeries, the fires had never truly gone out. The smell reached the streets before dawn. Warm grain. Hot ash. Damp dough rising slowly in large clay bowls. The scent drifted through narrow alleys where sand gathered against walls and baskets rested beside doorways. Even sleeping homes absorbed the smell. Bread was so central to life in ancient Egypt that nearly every morning began with its presence in the air. Large communal bakeries worked hardest during these dark early hours. Workers moved carefully through the heat carrying bundles of reeds and straw to feed the fires. Clay ovens glowed deep orange inside, their heat trapped within thick rounded walls blackened by years of smoke. The bakers themselves often looked exhausted even before sunrise. Their linen clothing clung to damp skin. Flour dust covered their arms and faces. Sweat mixed with ash until their bodies carried the permanent scent of heat and labor. They worked surrounded by grain every day of their lives. Crushed grain filled their lungs. Grain dust settled into their hair. Grain covered the floors beneath their bare feet. The bakeries smelled alive. Fermenting dough bubbled slowly in bowls large enough to feed entire worker crews. Warm yeast gave the rooms a sour softness that mixed with smoke from the ovens. Some loaves burned slightly against the hot clay walls, releasing a darker bitter smell into the air. The ovens crackled gently while outside the sky slowly lightened. Ancient Egyptian bread came in many shapes. Some loaves were round and thick. Others narrow or cone-shaped. Some were flavored with dates, herbs, or honey when ingredients could be spared. Wealthier households enjoyed finer bread with cleaner flour, but ordinary laborers often ate rough heavy loaves filled with bits of husk and sand from the grinding stones. The bread was dense enough to satisfy hunger during long hours beneath the sun. Workers carried it into fields wrapped in cloth. Boatmen ate it beside the river. Stonecutters rested with bread in dusty hands while towering monuments slowly rose around them. The smell of bread belonged to everyone. As the city slowly awakened, kitchen doors opened across the villages and towns. Smoke rose into the pale blue morning sky. Women swept floors with reed brushes while preparing the first meal of the day. Clay jars knocked softly together as water was poured into bowls. The kitchen smelled cooler in the early morning. Night air still lingered inside the walls. The heat had not yet fully returned. River breeze drifted gently through open spaces carrying the scent of wet mud and reeds. Some homes prepared porridge made from barley or emmer wheat. The smell was mild and earthy, thickening slowly above low flames. Others cooked beans with onions and garlic. Richer homes might roast small birds or prepare fresh cheese beside baskets of fruit. But no matter the household, smoke remained constant. Smoke curled into clothing. Smoke rested in blankets. Smoke darkened ceilings year after year. Ancient kitchens were places of fire more than anything else. Without fire, there was no bread, no beer, no cooked fish, no warmth during cold desert nights. Every family depended on it completely. Children grew up learning the smell of smoke before nearly anything else. As the sun climbed higher, the city became busier. Market streets slowly filled with merchants arranging baskets beneath woven shades. Fishermen carried fresh catches from the Nile while flies gathered around silver scales shining in morning light. Donkeys stepped heavily through dusty roads carrying grain sacks and clay jars. And everywhere, the smells of food traveled through the warming air. Near the markets, kitchens became crowded and loud. Street cooks prepared meals for laborers already exhausted from early work. Lentil stew simmered inside blackened pots. Fish roasted over open flames while oil dripped onto hot coals, sending thick smoky smells upward into the streets. The scent of coriander and cumin occasionally drifted through the heavier odors. Spices were valuable, though not always common among ordinary workers. Even small amounts could briefly brighten the atmosphere inside crowded kitchens. Fresh herbs were crushed beneath stone tools. Garlic skins piled beside cutting boards. Clay bowls held chopped onions soaking in oil. Nearby, brewers worked steadily beside enormous jars of fermenting beer. The smell there was strong enough to cling to the skin after only a short time. Sour grain. Foam. Wet barley. warm fermentation rising heavily into the air. The breweries were humid places compared to the dry heat outside. Workers stirred mixtures carefully while sweat rolled down their backs. Some breweries supplied temple workers or labor crews attached to royal projects. Others served ordinary neighborhoods where beer remained part of daily survival. Children sometimes carried small jars through the streets while balancing bread baskets against their hips. Their feet kicked dust softly into the air as they moved between homes and market stalls. Dust itself had a smell beneath the Egyptian sun. Dry earth. Hot stone. Sweat baked into the roads after countless footsteps. Kitchens near busy streets absorbed this dust constantly. It settled onto shelves, jars, and cooking tools. Women wiped surfaces again and again, but the desert always returned. By midday, the heat became overwhelming once more. The sun hung high above the Nile Valley without mercy. Workers in fields wrapped cloth around their heads while irrigation canals shimmered beneath bright light. Stone builders paused in narrow strips of shade when possible. Fishermen squinted against the glare rising from river water. Inside the kitchens, fires turned the rooms into ovens themselves. The air became thick and difficult to breathe. Smoke moved slowly. Oil lamps flickered weakly. Sweat dripped steadily onto packed earth floors. Cooking during these hours demanded endurance. Some kitchens reduced activity until later afternoon, but many could not stop. Bakers supplying labor crews continued feeding fires. Servants inside wealthy homes prepared large meals despite the heat. The smell of hot oil filled certain kitchens strongly during midday cooking. Fish or vegetables frying over flames created a rich heavy scent that stayed trapped inside enclosed rooms. Combined with sweat and smoke, the air could feel almost solid. Servants sometimes stepped briefly outside just to breathe cooler air from shaded courtyards. In noble homes, kitchens could be surprisingly distant from dining rooms. Wealthy Egyptians often separated cooking spaces because of heat and smell. The labor of preparing food remained hidden behind walls while cooler rooms stayed more comfortable for the household. But the workers inside those kitchens still lived surrounded by fire. Young servants learned quickly how to move safely around boiling pots and crowded ovens. Burns were common. Cuts from fish knives happened often. Heavy jars strained backs and shoulders. Kitchens demanded constant movement from sunrise until long after sunset. And still, there could be moments of quiet beauty there. A bowl of figs resting near an open doorway. Sunlight falling gently through drifting smoke. Fresh bread cooling beside clay jars of water. A cat asleep beneath a table while distant market sounds echoed softly outside. Ancient Egyptian life was difficult, but it was not without tenderness. Toward late afternoon, the strongest heat slowly began to fade. Long shadows stretched across village streets. Workers returned from fields carrying tools over tired shoulders. Boats drifted slowly back toward shore. The Nile reflected gold beneath the lowering sun. Evening kitchens awakened fully again. This was often the busiest and richest smelling time of day. Families gathered together while fires glowed warmly against the approaching darkness. Lentils simmered slowly beside roasting fish. Fresh herbs were crushed into simple sauces. Flat loaves warmed against oven walls while children waited sleepily nearby. The smells became softer now. Smoke drifted upward into cooler air. Bread released warm earthy steam. Garlic cooked gently in oil. Dates sweetened the atmosphere slightly. Outside, neighbors spoke quietly across narrow pathways while preparing their own meals. Entire villages smelled of food during these hours. The scent moved from house to house beneath the darkening sky until the whole settlement seemed wrapped in one enormous shared kitchen. Temple kitchens carried different smells entirely. Near the great temples, priests and servants prepared offerings for the gods each day. Bread, beer, fruit, roasted meats, oils, and incense filled sacred cooking spaces with richer fragrances than most ordinary homes could afford. Frankincense and myrrh drifted through temple halls. Roasted duck turned slowly above controlled fires. Honey cakes cooled on trays beside carved stone walls. The air smelled ceremonial there. But even sacred kitchens still required labor. Servants swept ashes. Workers hauled water. Cooks sweated beside flames. Behind every offering placed before a statue of a god stood hours of ordinary human exhaustion. As darkness finally covered the Nile Valley once again, many kitchens slowly began to quiet. Children slept first. Their breathing softened beside fading fires. Parents finished small tasks in low lamplight. Some repaired baskets or folded linen while embers glowed faintly nearby. Others simply rested in silence after another difficult day. The smells lingered longest after cooking ended. Ash cooling slowly. Bread crumbs resting on wooden tables. Fish oil trapped in clay pans. Smoke hanging gently beneath ceilings. Outside, stars spread across the sky above Egypt once more. The desert beyond the river remained vast and silent beneath moonlight. Palm trees whispered softly in the night breeze. And from hundreds of kitchens beside the endless Nile, the faint scent of warm bread and dying fires continued drifting upward into the ancient dark. During the flood season, the kitchens beside the Nile smelled different. The river rose slowly at first. Quietly. Almost gently. Water crept over the banks and spread across the dark soil of the valley. Farmers watched carefully as the flood waters widened beneath gray-blue skies heavy with heat. Boats drifted where dusty footpaths had once been. Reeds bent softly in the moving water. The smell of wet earth became stronger than at any other time of year. All across Egypt, kitchens absorbed this change. Mud clung to sandals carried indoors. Damp air settled against the walls. Water jars filled more easily now, but the river itself smelled richer and heavier during the floods. Rotting plants floated along the current beside fresh black silt carried from far to the south. The scent of the Nile became deep and fertile. Wet reeds. River weeds. Dark soil. Fish rising close to the surface. Inside the homes, women wiped moisture from clay storage jars while fires struggled slightly against the humid air. Smoke no longer rose cleanly upward. It drifted lower and slower through the kitchens, clinging to the ceiling beams before finally escaping through narrow openings. The smell of smoke became thicker during flood season. Wood and reeds sometimes burned unevenly from dampness. Ash turned soft beneath the ovens. Even bread changed slightly. The loaves baked more slowly in the heavier air, their crusts darker and softer than during the dry months. Outside, much of the farming work paused while flood waters covered the fields. This changed the rhythm of daily life. Men who normally spent long days digging irrigation channels or planting grain remained closer to home. Boats became more important than foot travel. Fishermen worked constantly because the flooded waters carried abundant fish into canals and marshes. The kitchens filled with the smell of fresh catch. Tilapia. Catfish. Perch. Some fish roasted immediately over open flames while others were cleaned and salted for storage. Fish scales glittered faintly across cutting boards and packed earth floors. The scent of river water lingered on hands long after cooking ended. Cats followed these smells everywhere. They waited patiently beside kitchen entrances or stretched near baskets filled with drying fish. Ancient Egypt loved its cats deeply, but kitchen cats were still working animals. They hunted rats drawn by grain stores and scraps of food. Their fur often smelled faintly of smoke from sleeping close to warm fires during cool nights. Flood season also brought insects. Mosquitoes hovered near standing water after sunset. Flies gathered thickly around food preparation areas. Kitchens worked constantly to protect grain and bread from pests. Cloth coverings rested over bowls. Storage jars were sealed carefully. Servants waved insects away with tired motions while continuing their work beside the heat. The smell of oils became stronger during these months too. People rubbed scented oils onto skin to protect against dryness, insects, and the harsh sun. In wealthier homes, kitchens sometimes carried the faint sweetness of perfumed oils drifting in from nearby rooms. Lotus oil, cedar oil, and other fragrances mixed strangely with smoke and fish and onions. Even beauty in ancient Egypt lived beside labor. In the villages, evenings during flood season could feel strangely peaceful. The waters reflected moonlight between the homes. Boats knocked softly against wooden posts near flooded paths. Families gathered indoors while warm winds drifted through open doorways carrying the scent of wet mud from the riverbanks. Cooking fires glowed brighter against the darkness. The kitchen smelled comforting in a heavy ancient way. Bean stew simmering slowly. Fresh bread cooling on woven mats. Garlic crushed with herbs. Fish crackling gently over flames. Children grew sleepy listening to the soft sounds of cooking while outside frogs called endlessly from flooded fields. Some older workers sat silently after meals, too tired to speak much. Their hands remained rough from years of labor. Stonecutters carried permanent dust deep inside their skin. Farmers smelled constantly of earth and river water. Boatmen smelled of damp rope and fish oil. The kitchens welcomed them all back each night. A place to sit. A place to eat. A place where warm food waited beside firelight. For ordinary Egyptians, this mattered more than luxury ever could. Farther north in larger cities, the kitchens of taverns and public eating places remained busy deep into the evening. Travelers arrived by boat during flood season because waterways allowed easier movement between settlements. Market districts stayed crowded near docks and river landings. The smells there became almost overwhelming. Roasting meat. Beer spilling across wooden tables. Fish stew bubbling in large blackened pots. Sweat from crowded rooms packed with tired laborers and merchants. Smoke drifting endlessly toward dark rafters overhead. Voices murmured softly late into the night while oil lamps flickered against walls stained by years of fire and cooking grease. In wealthier homes, evening meals sometimes lasted longer. Servants carried trays between kitchen courtyards and dining spaces. Ducks roasted slowly beside vegetables cooked in oil and herbs. Figs and dates rested in polished bowls. Honey-sweetened cakes prepared carefully for noble families. The kitchen smelled richer there, though still deeply tied to heat and physical work. Servants remained awake long after the household rested. They scrubbed clay pots beside dim lamps. They swept grain dust from the floors. They prepared dough for the next morning before finally lying down to sleep for only a few short hours. Ancient kitchens rarely rested fully. Even in darkness, the scent of preparation lingered. Soaked grain waiting for dawn. Cooling ovens releasing trapped heat. Ash settling quietly into silence. Beyond the cities and villages, along lonely stretches of the Nile, smaller homes rested beneath the stars. Fishermen living beside marshes cooked simple meals over tiny fires. Their kitchens smelled strongly of river reeds and smoke. Nets hung drying beside doorways while fish simmered slowly inside clay pots. Desert travelers stopping near the river prepared flat bread beneath open skies. Sand drifted into their food no matter how carefully they cooked. Their fires smelled sharp and dry from desert wood and brush. In military camps stationed far from major cities, soldiers gathered around communal cooking fires after long marches. Sweat-soaked linen dried beside flames while rough bread baked on heated stones. The smell of tired bodies mixed with smoke and stew beneath the cold desert night. Everywhere across Egypt, kitchens shaped the rhythm of life. The smell of bread marked the beginning of the day. The smell of cooking fish marked evening. Smoke marked nearly every hour in between. Even the dead carried traces of these kitchen worlds with them. Many tomb paintings showed food preparation scenes because meals remained important beyond death. Bakers, brewers, and servants appeared painted carefully on tomb walls preparing bread and beer for eternity. The ancient Egyptians believed the dead would continue needing nourishment in the afterlife. And so kitchens became part of eternity itself. Inside royal tombs deep beneath the desert, painted ovens glowed forever in mineral colors. Loaves of bread rested eternally beside jars of beer. Fish and ducks appeared ready for endless meals beneath the silent earth. The smells themselves were gone. But the memory remained carved into stone. Back in the living world, another night slowly deepened beside the Nile. The floodwaters moved gently beneath moonlight. Palm leaves rustled in warm wind. Somewhere far away, a temple drum sounded softly and faded into silence again. Inside the homes, most fires had burned low now. Families slept close together while faint smoke lingered in the dark rooms. Clay walls slowly released the heat stored from the long day. A few embers still glowed red beneath ash, breathing softly like tiny living creatures. The kitchen smelled quiet now. Warm dust. Old smoke. Cooling bread. Faint traces of onions and herbs. And beneath everything else, always the Nile itself drifting through the darkness nearby, carrying the scent of wet earth and endless water through the sleeping ancient world. When the cool season arrived, the mornings beside the Nile felt softer. The fierce heat that ruled much of the year loosened its grip for a little while. Before sunrise, the air carried a gentle chill drifting across the riverbanks and through the narrow village streets. Workers waking before dawn sometimes wrapped thin linen cloths more tightly around their shoulders while stepping outside into the darkness. Inside the kitchens, the fires felt especially welcome during these colder mornings. The first smell was always smoke. Dry reeds crackling softly. Small pieces of wood catching flame. Old ashes waking beneath fresh fire. The scent drifted slowly through sleeping homes while the sky remained dark blue beyond the doorways. In the cooler air, the smoke lingered longer and smelled sharper, almost sweet at times when certain woods burned cleanly. Women knelt beside grinding stones while children still slept nearby beneath blankets woven from rough linen. The grinding began slowly, steadily, like a familiar rhythm repeated thousands of times through countless generations. Stone against stone. Grain becoming flour. Dust rising into firelight. The kitchen smelled quieter during these early cold hours. The heavy odors of sweat and intense heat had not yet filled the rooms. Instead there was the earthy scent of crushed grain and the gentle warmth of clay ovens beginning to glow. Outside, the Nile moved silently beneath pale mist. This mist fascinated many travelers who came to Egypt long ago. In the cool season, thin white fog sometimes floated over the water during dawn, softening the outlines of boats and palm trees. Fishermen pushed silently through the haze while distant cooking fires sent narrow streams of smoke upward into the brightening sky. The river smelled calmer in cooler weather. Less rot. Less heavy heat. More damp earth and reeds. Kitchens near the water opened their doors wider now, allowing fresh morning air to move through the rooms while bread baked nearby. This was also the season when many labor projects intensified. The floodwaters had withdrawn. Rich black soil covered the fields. Farmers worked long hours planting crops beneath milder skies. Stone workers hauled materials for temples and tombs while conditions remained less punishing than during the hottest months. Because of this, kitchens became busier too. Large groups of workers needed feeding every day. Bread ovens worked constantly. Beer jars emptied quickly. Fish dried beside rows of onions and garlic prepared for labor crews. The smell surrounding worker settlements became thick with food production from sunrise until late night. Near major building projects, entire sections of settlements existed almost entirely to support cooking and storage. Bakers prepared hundreds upon hundreds of loaves each day. Brewers stirred enormous jars of fermenting grain. Servants cleaned fish beside long wooden tables darkened from years of use. These places smelled powerful. Hot bread and sweat. Fish oil and damp grain. Ash and wet clay. Human exhaustion woven into everything. Yet there was also order in these kitchens. Ancient Egypt depended deeply on routine. Workers expected meals at certain times. Grain deliveries arrived steadily from storehouses. Water carriers moved constantly between the Nile and the kitchens. Even in noisy, crowded settlements, the flow of food preparation followed rhythms as dependable as the river itself. At sunrise, workers ate before labor. At midday, meals paused briefly beneath whatever shade could be found. At evening, kitchens glowed warmly as families gathered once again. The smells marked the passing hours more clearly than clocks ever could. During the cool season, some kitchens prepared richer stews because ingredients lasted longer before spoiling. Lentils simmered for hours beside onions and herbs. Goat meat occasionally cooked slowly over low fires when families could afford it. The scent of broth drifting through homes during cold mornings brought a deep sense of comfort after long labor. Fresh herbs appeared more often now too. Parsley, coriander, dill mint. Crushed beneath stone tools, they released green sharp scents into the smoky air. For brief moments, kitchens smelled almost bright before smoke and roasting grain covered everything again. In wealthier districts, cooks prepared elaborate meals for noble households enjoying the pleasant weather. Open courtyards filled with servants carrying baskets of figs, dates, pomegranates, and fresh vegetables gathered from fertile riverbanks. The kitchens smelled sweet and earthy together. Honey warming gently near bread ovens. Roasted birds brushed with oils. Fresh fruit split open beneath bronze knives. Still, the labor behind these meals remained endless. Servants rose before everyone else and slept after everyone else. Their hands cracked from constant washing and grinding. Their backs ached from carrying heavy jars filled with water or grain. Kitchens demanded patience more than strength. Above the Nile River fell work repeated endlessly day after day. Some servants likely knew the kitchens better than any other place in their lives. They memorized every smell, every sound of boiling pots, every shift in the ovens, every texture of dough beneath tired fingers. In the poorer villages farther from the grand cities, meals stayed much simpler. Many homes survived mostly on bread, beer, onions, and occasional fish. During difficult seasons, even these became scarce. Kitchens in these homes smelled plain and smoky. Thin soups stretched small amounts of grain across large families. Old bread softened slowly inside clay bowls filled with broth. But even simple food carried meaning. Sharing warm bread beside a fire after a cold morning in the fields could feel deeply satisfying. Ancient Egyptian life offered few luxuries to ordinary workers. Small moments of warmth and fullness mattered greatly. As the day passed into afternoon, the cool air slowly disappeared beneath sunlight. Children played beside irrigation canals while women washed cooking tools near the water's edge. Wet clay jars cooled in the shade. Cats wandered lazily through open kitchen doors searching for scraps or resting places near warm ovens. The smell of drying fish often returned strongest during afternoon hours. Rows of fish hung beneath the sun beside homes and workshops. Salt crusted their skin while flies buzzed heavily around them. The scent drifted through nearby streets and entered every open doorway. Some travelers probably found the smell overwhelming. But for people living beside the Nile, it was simply part of life. Fish fed families. Fish supported workers. Fish filled storage jars for leaner seasons. The smell meant survival. As evening approached, shadows stretched longer across the riverbanks. Palm trees swayed gently against orange skies while boats returned slowly toward shore. Farmers washed dust from their hands and faces before entering their homes. The entire world seemed to soften beneath the lowering sun. Evening kitchens during the cool season felt especially peaceful. The fires glowed warmly against the growing darkness. Bread baked slowly while families gathered nearby. Oil lamps flickered beside mud-brick walls stained dark from years of smoke. The smell of roasting onions filled the air. Children rested sleepily beside their parents while quiet conversations drifted through the rooms. Some workers repaired sandals or mended baskets after dinner. Others simply sat silently, too tired for much speaking after long hours in the fields. Outside, neighbors could smell one another's meals drifting through the village. Garlic from one house. Fish stew from another. Fresh bread from nearly every doorway. The smells blended together beneath the cool night sky until the entire settlement felt wrapped in warmth and smoke and grain. In temples, sacred kitchens prepared evening offerings beneath torchlight. Priests moved quietly through stone corridors carrying trays of bread, fruit, beer, and roasted meat toward the inner sanctuaries. Incense drifted through the air in pale clouds. Frankincense smelled rich and resinous. Myrrh carried a darker sweetness. These sacred scents mixed strangely with ordinary kitchen smoke nearby, reminding everyone that even the gods depended upon food prepared by human hands. Late at night, after most homes had gone silent, a few kitchens still remained active. Night bakers shaped dough beneath dim lamps. Brewers checked fermenting jars. Guards warmed simple meals over fading coals. The smell of warm grain continued drifting through the darkness long after most of Egypt had fallen asleep. And far above the sleeping villages and riverbanks, the stars shone cold and steady over the ancient land while the Nile flowed onward through the quiet night, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant reeds beneath the endless sky. In the larger cities of ancient Egypt, the kitchens never truly became silent. Even deep in the night, somewhere beyond the dark alleys and sleeping courtyards, a fire still glowed behind a mud-brick wall. Bakers prepared dough for dawn. Brewers stirred grain inside tall jars. Temple servants carried food through torch-lit corridors while most of the city rested beneath the stars. The air itself seemed filled with old cooking smells that never completely disappeared. Smoke rested over the rooftops like a thin invisible blanket. Ash drifted softly through narrow streets. Warm grain lingered in the walls of homes long after the fires had cooled. Cities beside the Nile carried these scents constantly because so many people lived close together. Houses leaned against one another along winding lanes where sunlight barely reached the ground during certain hours of the day. Cooking fires from hundreds of homes mixed together until entire neighborhoods smelled of bread and smoke from morning until night. In poorer districts, the kitchens were often little more than small corners of crowded rooms. A clay oven. A few bowls. A grinding stone. Storage jars sealed carefully against rats and insects. Families slept only a few steps away from the fires used to prepare every meal. The smell of smoke settled deeply into blankets and clothing. Infants breathed it from the moment they were born. Elderly workers carried it in their hair after lifetimes spent beside ovens and cooking pits. The kitchens shaped the body as much as the spirit. Eyes watered constantly from smoke. Hands roughened from grinding grain. Backs bent slowly from years of kneeling beside fires. Yet every morning the work began again before dawn. In the marketplaces, food sellers arrived while the streets were still dim and quiet. They carried baskets balanced carefully on shoulders or heads. Some sold fresh bread wrapped in cloth still warm from the ovens. Others carried dried fish, onions, beans, figs, or jars of beer sealed with clay stoppers. The smells gathered slowly as the market awakened. Fresh herbs crushed beneath sandals. Fish resting on damp reeds. Dates warmed by early sunlight. Dust rising beneath donkey hooves. Soon the market kitchens began cooking openly for workers and travelers moving through the city. Oil hissed softly over flames. Flat bread browned against heated stone. Stew simmered inside blackened clay pots. The scent drifted between stalls selling linen, pottery, copper tools, and baskets woven from river reeds. Some laborers ate standing in the streets before beginning long hours of work. Others sat quietly in small shaded corners with rough bread and beer while the city grew hotter around them. Ancient Egyptian cities could become unbearably warm by midday. The stone walls trapped heat. The streets held little moving air. Kitchen fires made everything heavier. Sweat gathered beneath linen clothing almost immediately after sunrise. Water sellers moved constantly through the crowds carrying clay jars cooled from the river. Their jars smelled pleasantly damp against the dry dusty air of the streets. Near the docks, kitchens smelled strongly of the Nile itself. Boats arrived carrying fish, grain, vegetables, papyrus reeds, and sometimes animals brought from distant regions. The docks were noisy places during daylight hours, filled with shouting workers and creaking ropes. But beneath the sounds lived the smells. Wet wood from river boats. Fish scales baking beneath the sun. Mud clinging to sandals. Smoke from cooking fires drifting through the crowded riverfront. Dock workers often ate quickly beside the water before returning to labor. Their meals were simple but filling. Bread dipped into oil. Fish roasted over small fires. Beer poured carefully from clay jars into cups shared between tired hands. The kitchens near the docks worked constantly because the workers themselves rarely stopped moving. Farther from the river, wealthier homes rested behind larger walls and shaded courtyards. Their kitchens remained hidden deeper inside the household where servants labored out of sight. These kitchens could be surprisingly large. Rows of clay ovens lined the walls. Storage rooms held grain sacks stacked high beside jars of honey and oil. Bundles of herbs hung drying from ceiling beams. The smell here felt layered and rich. Cinnamon imported from distant trade routes sometimes appeared in noble kitchens, though rarely. More common were coriander, cumin, garlic, and dill blending into the warm smoky air. Roasted meats turned slowly above controlled fires while servants prepared vegetables beside polished stone counters. But despite the richer ingredients, the kitchens still carried exhaustion inside them. Servants hurried constantly between heat and smoke. Water had to be carried. Fires needed tending. Food spoiled quickly if neglected. Even luxury required endless labor from unseen hands. Some servants likely spent nearly their entire lives within these cooking spaces. Young girls learned kitchen work from older women. Boys carried fuel, water, or grain until they grew older and stronger. The kitchens became worlds of their own filled with routines repeated every single day. The smell of baking bread marked the hours. The sound of grinding stones marked the mornings. The glow of ovens marked the nights. Outside the noble homes, ordinary city life continued beneath drifting smoke and sunlight. Children ran barefoot through dusty alleys carrying pieces of bread in small hands. Cats rested atop warm walls while flies buzzed lazily above market scraps. Water splashed softly from irrigation channels running beside gardens where vegetables and herbs grew close to the river. Gardens brought another smell into Egyptian kitchens. Green things. Fresh mint. Cut cucumbers. Leaves crushed between fingers. These softer scents balanced the heavier smells of smoke and fish, especially during cooler evening hours when families prepared their final meals of the day. In the workers' districts, evenings often began quietly. Men returned from labor with dust covering their skin and clothing. Stone workers carried pale powder deep inside the lines of their hands. Farmers smelled of earth and river water. Fishermen smelled of wet nets drying beneath the sun. The kitchens welcomed them all back into warmth. Women stirred stew slowly while children waited nearby growing sleepy from hunger and exhaustion. Oil lamps flickered gently against dark walls. Outside, neighbors spoke softly across rooftops while smoke rose into the fading light. The smells became especially comforting after sunset. Warm lentils. Roasted onions. Fresh bread cooling near open windows. Ash drifting softly from dying fires. Sometimes music floated faintly through the streets during festivals or religious celebrations. Drums echoed softly from temple courtyards. Incense drifted through the night air from sacred processions carrying offerings beneath torchlight. During festival days, kitchens transformed completely. Families saved precious ingredients for these occasions. More meat roasted over the fires. Honey cakes baked slowly in clay ovens. Wine appeared more often alongside beer. Herbs and oils scented the air richly while relatives gathered together beneath decorated courtyards. The smell of celebration lingered long into the night. Roasted duck. Sweet cakes. Spiced oils warming gently beside fires. But even festivals eventually faded back into ordinary life. The fires cooled. The guests departed. The kitchens returned to bread and onions and daily survival. Late at night, after the city had mostly gone quiet, some workers still remained awake beside the ovens. Bakers preparing morning loaves moved silently through flour dust and smoke. Their shadows flickered against the walls while the city slept around them. Outside, moonlight rested softly on temple columns and calm river water. The Nile flowed endlessly beside the sleeping land. Boats rocked gently against their ropes. Palm leaves whispered in the night breeze. Dogs wandered quietly through empty streets searching for scraps near cooling kitchens. Inside the homes, the smell of the evening meal still lingered in the darkness. Bread crumbs rested on tables. Clay bowls cooled beside sleeping mats. Ash settled softly over dying embers. And through the warm ancient night, Egypt continued breathing slowly beneath the stars, carried forward by firelight, grain, river water, and the endless patient rhythm of its kitchens. Far from the crowded cities, where the Nile widened beside stretches of quiet farmland, the kitchens of the farming villages moved to an older rhythm. Life there followed the river more closely than anywhere else. The people watched the flood waters rise and fall. They studied the color of the soil. They listened to the wind moving through reeds beside the canals. Their kitchens reflected these seasons gently, almost like living things connected to the land itself. Before dawn, the villages were wrapped in deep silence. The stars still covered the sky. Cool air drifted low across the fields. Palm trees stood dark against the horizon while small cooking fires slowly awakened inside the homes one by one. From a distance, the village seemed to glow softly in the darkness. Tiny orange lights flickering behind mud-brick walls. Thin streams of smoke rising into the cold morning air. The first smells belonged to the fires themselves. Dry reeds burned quickly with a sharp grassy scent. Straw crackled softly beneath clay ovens. Sometimes dried animal dung smoldered slowly, filling the kitchens with a thick earthy smoke that clung heavily to clothing and blankets. Fuel was precious in many farming villages. Wood was not always easy to gather along the Nile, especially in heavily settled areas. Families used whatever could burn slowly enough to cook bread and boil water. Nothing was wasted. Inside the homes, women moved quietly through the darkness preparing the first meal before the fields called everyone away again. Their hands worked almost automatically after years of repetition. Grain poured into grinding stones. Water splashed softly into clay bowls. Dough pressed carefully against warm oven walls. Children often remained asleep nearby while the kitchens came alive around them. The smell of bread slowly spread through the room until even dreams likely carried traces of warm grain and smoke. In these farming villages, kitchens smelled simpler than those in wealthy homes or crowded cities. Less spice. Less meat. Less sweetness. But there was something steady and deeply human in their plainness. Bread. Onions. Beans. Fish when the river allowed it. Fresh herbs gathered near irrigation canals. The smell of ordinary survival repeated day after day beside the Nile. As dawn approached, the village slowly awakened. Doors opened onto narrow dirt paths. Men stretched tired muscles before walking toward the fields carrying wooden tools over their shoulders. Donkeys shifted beside fences made from reeds and mud. Chickens scratched through the dust near kitchen scraps tossed outside during the night. The smell of damp earth rose strongly during morning hours. Farmers irrigated the fields carefully using canals and water-lifting tools beside the riverbanks. Wet soil clung to their sandals and feet. When they returned briefly to eat during midday, they carried the scent of mud and green-growing plants directly into the kitchens. The kitchens absorbed everything. Field dust. River water. Sweat. Smoke. The smells of labor became part of the walls themselves. Some homes stored grain in large clay silos attached to the house or buried partly underground to protect it from heat and pests. Opening these storage spaces released a deep dry scent into the air. Dusty grain. Earth. Old straw. A faint bitterness from years of harvests resting together in darkness. Grain was life in ancient Egypt. Without it, the kitchens fell silent. Without it, workers weakened. Without it, entire villages faced hunger. Every loaf of bread carried the memory of fields worked beneath burning sunlight. Every jar of beer carried the labor of farmers bending over wet soil while birds circled slowly overhead. The kitchens reminded people of this connection constantly. By midday, the coolness of morning had vanished. Sunlight pressed heavily across the valley. The mud brick walls grew warm to the touch. Inside the kitchens, fires added another layer of heat until the air became thick and still. Many people slowed their movements during these hours. Women stirred stews quietly while sweat rolled down their necks. Older family members rested near shaded walls. Children sat silently in doorways watching insects move through the bright sunlight outside. The smell of onions cooking slowly in oil often filled the homes during midday meals. Simple bean stews simmered gently in blackened clay pots. Sometimes garlic and herbs were added if available. The scent was rich without being luxurious. It smelled filling. Practical. heavy enough to support long hours of labor beneath the sun. Flies buzzed constantly through the kitchens during hot afternoons. They gathered near fish, damp grain, and cooking scraps. Cats watched them lazily from shaded corners while oil lamps remained unlit against the bright daylight pouring through the doorways. In some villages, communal ovens served many families together. Women carried prepared dough through dusty streets balanced carefully on wooden boards or cloth-covered baskets. The communal oven smelled especially powerful because so much bread baked there each day. Warm yeast, burned crust, ash drifting upward in pale clouds. Children often lingered nearby waiting for fresh loaves to emerge from the heat. Bakers worked with arms coated in flour and sweat while smoke curled around their faces. The ovens became gathering places as much as kitchens. People exchanged quiet conversations while waiting. News moved slowly between homes. Stories drifted gently through the warm smoky air. Ancient Egypt often appears silent in the imagination, filled only with stone monuments and empty desert. But the villages beside the Nile were full of small ordinary sounds. Grinding stones. Crackling fires. Clay jars knocking together. Soft conversations beneath the evening sky. And always the kitchens breathing steadily at the center of life. As afternoon softened toward evening, the fields slowly emptied. Farmers returned carrying tools darkened by wet soil. Their bodies ached from bending, digging, lifting, and planting beneath the sun. Some washed briefly beside irrigation canals before entering their homes. Others sat quietly outside for a few moments simply enjoying cooler air after the long day. Evening kitchens welcomed them with familiar smells. Bread warming beside the fire. Fish roasting gently over coals. Lentils simmering slowly. Fresh mint crushed into sauces or drinks. The air cooled enough now for smoke to rise more cleanly through the night sky. Palm trees whispered softly in the evening breeze. Somewhere nearby, frogs croaked beside dark canals reflecting the first stars of night. Inside the homes, families gathered close together. The firelight painted soft shadows across the walls. Children leaned sleepily against parents after eating. Older workers stretched tired feet toward the warmth of the ovens while quiet conversation drifted through the room. Sometimes the kitchen smelled especially comforting after long days in the fields. Fresh bread broken open by hand. Garlic softening slowly in hot oil. Warm beer poured carefully into clay cups. The scent of herbs lingering gently above everything else. These were not grand meals. But they carried peace. In wealthier seasons after good harvests, the kitchens became fuller. Dates piled high in baskets. Figs dried beneath the sun. Duck or goat appeared during celebrations. Honey sweetened cakes for festivals and family gatherings. The smell during these moments felt richer, softer, more joyful. Yet even then, the kitchens remained grounded in labor and routine. Every ingredient still came from human hands working beside the river. As night deepened across the farming villages, most fires slowly burned lower. The stars spread wide above the fields. The Nile reflected pale moonlight between dark river reeds. Boats drifted quietly near the banks while distant insects hummed through the warm darkness. Inside the homes, the kitchens settled into silence once more. Only the faint smell of cooling ash remained. A little smoke trapped in the blankets. Bread crumbs resting on wooden tables. Clay pots still warm from the evening meal. And beyond the quiet villages, beyond the fields and canals and sleeping workers, the ancient river continued flowing patiently through the night, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and endless time. In the desert settlements beyond the green edges of the Nile, the kitchens felt smaller against the vastness of the world. The fertile river valley could disappear quickly in ancient Egypt. Only a short walk beyond the irrigated fields, the earth became dry and pale beneath the sun. Green reeds gave way to stone and sand. Wind moved differently there. The air smelled thinner, sharper, emptier. And yet even in these harsh places, kitchens still glowed softly in the darkness each night. Mining camps, quarry settlements, guard posts, and small desert villages depended upon long supply lines from the Nile. Workers hauled stone beneath brutal sunlight while scribes carefully counted grain deliveries and water jars. Life in these settlements was difficult and isolated. The kitchens carried the burden of keeping people alive far from the river. Before dawn, the desert air could feel surprisingly cold. Workers sleeping inside rough mudbrick shelters or stone huts pulled thin blankets closer around themselves while stars burned brightly overhead. Silence stretched across the desert hills so completely that even small sounds traveled far. A single cooking fire crackling in the darkness could be heard across the camp. The first smell each morning was dry smoke. Desert wood and brush burned differently than reeds from the Nile Valley. The fires smelled sharper and more bitter. Fuel remained scarce in these places, so cooks used every possible material carefully. Dried dung, brittle shrubs, broken crates, and scraps of wood all fed the flames. The smoke lingered low in the cold air before slowly disappearing into the fading night. Inside the kitchens, workers prepared simple meals before the day's labor began. Bread dough rested inside rough bowls while fires heated flat stones for baking. Water was precious here. Every drop mattered. Cooking had to be done carefully. The kitchen smelled dusty. Dust settled everywhere in the desert settlements. On the floor. Inside the storage jars. Across sleeping mats and cooking tools. Even fresh bread carried traces of sand because the wind never fully stopped moving through these harsh dry places. Laborers working in quarries often began before sunrise to avoid the worst heat later in the day. They carried rough bread, onions, and beer into the hills while the sky slowly brightened over the eastern desert. The kitchens watched them leave each morning. Long lines of tired men walking into silence and stone. Some returned coated white with limestone dust. Others carried reddish sand deep in the folds of their clothing. Their bodies smelled of heat long before midday arrived. At the quarry kitchens, meals had to feed large numbers of exhausted workers. Massive bread ovens baked continuously while cooks stirred thick pots of beans or lentils over open fires. The smell there was heavy and practical. Smoke. Boiling grain. Sweat. Warm clay. Nothing delicate survived long in the desert heat. Fish rarely smelled fresh after long transport from the Nile, so many camps relied heavily on dried or salted food supplies. The scent of preserved fish became especially strong inside storage rooms where jars and baskets rested in the darkness. Salt. Dry scales. Old oil. The smell could cling to a room for years. Water jars lined the walls of many kitchens, carefully sealed against evaporation and contamination. When opened, the jars released cool earthy smells from the clay itself. Workers often paused briefly beside them after returning from labor, drinking slowly while dust streaked their skin and faces. The taste of cool water in the desert likely felt more precious than almost anything else. By midday, the settlements became nearly unbearable beneath the sun. Heat pressed down from above while pale stone reflected light upward from below. The air shimmered. Sand burned against bare feet. Even breathing felt heavy after hours outside. Inside the kitchens, the fires turned the rooms into furnaces. Cooks sweated constantly. Smoke stuck to damp skin. Flies moved lazily through the heat. The smell of human exhaustion filled every corner. Some workers rested briefly in narrow strips of shade beside the kitchens during midday breaks. They ate slowly and quietly, too drained for conversation. Bread hardened quickly in the desert air, becoming dry and rough unless dipped into stew or beer. Beer itself changed in the heat. Fermentation moved faster during hot months. Some jars soured quickly. The smell inside desert breweries could become especially sharp and heavy beneath the blazing sun. Warm yeast. Sour grain. Fermenting foam rising inside sealed jars. Yet even imperfect beer mattered deeply. It nourished workers and replaced water lost through endless sweating. Far from the river, the kitchens became emotional centers as much as practical ones. The desert could feel frighteningly empty at night. Endless dark hills stretched beyond the reach of firelight. Wind moved through rocky valleys carrying cold air after sunset. Workers far from home gathered close around the warmth and smells of cooking fires because the kitchens reminded them of the Nile Valley they had left behind. The smell of bread meant safety. The smell of onions cooking meant shelter. The smell of smoke meant human presence against the silent desert. As evening arrived, the settlements softened slightly beneath cooler air. Workers returned slowly from quarries and mines carrying tools over aching shoulders. Some limped from injuries or exhaustion. Others sat silently beside walls while cooks prepared the evening meal nearby. The kitchens glowed beautifully then. Orange firelight flickered against stone walls. Clay ovens radiated warmth into the darkness. Steam rose gently from pots simmering over coals. Outside, the desert sky turned deep purple beneath the first stars. Meals remained simple in these remote places, but after a long day beneath the burning sun, even plain food carried enormous comfort. Warm lentils. Fresh bread if enough grain remained. Oil poured carefully over vegetables. Sometimes dried dates shared quietly between workers. The smells drifted through the camps while conversations stayed low and tired. Many workers likely missed their homes deeply during these evenings. They missed the river breeze, the green fields, the familiar smells of village kitchens beside the Nile. In the desert, even the smoke smelled lonely. Some settlements housed skilled artisans working on royal tombs hidden deep in the rocky valleys. These workers lived for months or years away from major cities while carving and painting chambers for the dead. Their kitchens became small worlds of routine. Morning bread. Midday stew. Evening beer beside fading fires. The same smells repeated endlessly while tomb walls slowly filled with painted scenes of eternal life. Perhaps some of those artists painted kitchen scenes because they missed them. Bread ovens. Beer jars. Women grinding grain. Fish hanging to dry beside river homes. Ordinary moments became precious when surrounded by desert silence. Late at night, after the workers had fallen asleep, the camps grew incredibly still. The fires cooled slowly beneath ash. A few guards remained awake beside small flames. Wind moved softly across the rocky ground. And above everything stretched the enormous ancient sky filled with stars so bright they almost seemed close enough to touch. Inside the dark kitchens, the smells lingered quietly. Smoke trapped in linen blankets. Dust resting over bread crumbs. Cooling clay pots. The faint sourness of beer jars waiting for morning. And somewhere far beyond the desert hills, hidden in darkness, the Nile continued flowing through the sleeping heart of Egypt, carrying its endless scent of water and reeds beneath the moonlit night. Along the edges of the Nile Delta, where the river spread itself into many winding branches before meeting the distant sea, the kitchens carried different smells again. The air there felt heavier with moisture. Birds gathered in enormous numbers among the reeds and marshes. Fish filled the waterways. Boats moved constantly through narrow channels lined with papyrus plants swaying gently beneath the breeze. The land smelled alive. Wet soil. Salt drifting faintly from the northern waters. Rotting reeds warming beneath the sun. Mud stirred by fishermen pulling their boats ashore. The kitchens of the delta absorbed all of it. In the early morning darkness, before the marsh birds fully awakened, small fishing villages already stirred beside the water. Thin streams of smoke rose slowly from low mud brick homes while the river channels reflected fading stars. The fishermen woke first. Their nets rested in damp piles beside doorways. Some smelled sharply of old fish and river plants after many days of use. Men repaired torn sections carefully by lamplight while wives or daughters prepared simple meals nearby. The kitchen smelled strongly of water here. Even the walls seemed damp during cooler mornings. Clay jars sweated softly in the humid air. Reeds used for roofing carried the scent of marsh plants long after being cut and dried. The fires struggled slightly in this moisture. Smoke drifted thickly through the rooms before escaping outside. It smelled softer than desert smoke. Less sharp. More mixed with wet earth and reeds. Bread still baked each morning, but fish dominated the kitchens of the delta more than anywhere else in Egypt. Fresh fish. Drying fish. Salted fish stored for travel. Fish stew simmering slowly over low flames. Fish oil soaking into wooden tools and woven baskets. The smell clung to everything. Cats prowled constantly through these homes searching for scraps. Their paws carried mud from the riverbanks onto kitchen floors. At night they curled beside ovens still warm from baking while insects hummed softly beyond the walls. Outside, the marshland slowly brightened beneath dawn. Bird calls echoed across the water channels. Fishermen pushed boats through thick reeds using long poles while mist drifted low over the surface of the river. Their breakfasts were often eaten quickly before departure. Rough bread. Onions. Beer poured from clay jars. Sometimes leftover fish from the evening before. The kitchens watched them disappear into the waterways as the sun slowly climbed into the sky. Women remained behind to continue the endless work of the household. Grinding grain. Cleaning fish. Fetching water. Repairing baskets. Preparing meals for workers who would return exhausted by evening. The kitchens were rarely still for long. As daylight strengthened, the delta villages became noisier than many desert settlements farther south. Water carried sound easily. Voices traveled across canals. Boats knocked softly against wooden docks. Children splashed beside riverbanks while birds circled overhead searching for fish near the surface. The smell of wet reeds remained constant through all of it. Papyrus plants grew thickly in many areas of the delta. Their fresh green scent drifted through nearby kitchens whenever bundles were carried indoors for weaving or storage. Mats, baskets, sandals, and writing materials all depended upon these river plants. Even daily life smelled partly of papyrus. Inside the kitchens, the morning catch often needed immediate preparation before the heat spoiled it. Fish scales glittered across cutting boards. Knives scraped softly against bone. Salt-covered tables and baskets used for preservation. The scent could become overwhelming during hot weather, especially in crowded homes with poor ventilation. Yet for the people of the delta, these smells likely meant prosperity and survival. The waterways fed them generously compared to harsher regions deeper in the desert. Some kitchens near larger river towns also prepared food for traveling merchants and sailors moving between northern ports and inland cities. These cooking spaces became crowded and busy from sunrise until late night. The smells layered heavily together. Roasting fish. Fresh bread. Boiling lentils. beer foam spilling across wooden tables. Sweat from tired travelers arriving after long journeys on the river. In these places, cooks worked endlessly beside open fires while flies buzzed around hanging fish and baskets of onions. Oil lamps blackened the ceilings with smoke year after year. Clay ovens radiated heat against walls dampened slightly by the northern air. The kitchens felt alive every hour of the day. By midday, sunlight reflected brilliantly from the waterways outside. The marshes shimmered beneath the heat. Insects hovered above reeds. Boats moved more slowly now as workers tired beneath the sun. Some fishermen returned early carrying baskets heavy with catch while others remained far out among the channels. Inside the homes, midday meals often smelled rich with fish broth and herbs gathered near the water. Fresh dill, coriander, wild greens growing beside canals. The scent of simmering stew filled entire neighborhoods during the hottest hours. Steam drifted through open windows while families rested briefly from labor. Some homes cooked shellfish or river birds when available. Roasted duck became especially valued in marsh regions where waterfowl gathered in large numbers. The smell of roasting bird fat dripping onto flames spread warmly through evening air during special meals or festivals. Compared to the dry desert settlements, the delta kitchens often smelled softer and wetter. Less dust. More damp wood and river mud. Less dry smoke. More steam rising from boiling pots. The environment shaped every detail of life beside the Nile. In wealthier delta towns, merchants returning from distant trade routes occasionally brought unusual ingredients northward through the waterways. Spices, oils, wine, and fruits from other lands entered Egyptian kitchens slowly through these trading connections. The richer homes smelled more varied because of this. Imported oils warming beside fish stew. Sweet wine opened during evening gatherings. Honey cakes cooling near shaded windows. Still, beneath these luxuries remained the same familiar foundation of ancient Egyptian kitchens. Fire. Grain. River water. Human labor. As evening approached, the delta became especially beautiful. Golden sunlight spread across the marshes while birds settled among the reeds. Boats returned slowly toward shore carrying tired fishermen coated with the scent of river water and fish scales. Smoke rose gently from the villages while cooking fires awakened once more. Evening kitchens glowed warmly against the deepening blue sky. The smell of roasting fish drifted everywhere. Garlic softened slowly in hot oil. Fresh bread cracked gently as it cooled. Beer poured into cups beside quiet conversations. Families gathered close while insects hummed outside in the marsh darkness. The cooler air allowed people to linger longer near doorways and courtyards after meals. Children listened sleepily to the sounds of water moving through nearby canals. Some older fishermen repaired nets beneath lamplight while wives cleaned the final dishes of the evening. Others simply sat quietly together after exhausting days on the river. The kitchens held all these moments gently. The warmth of the fires. The smell of bread and fish. The soft glow of oil lamps against damp mudbrick walls. Late into the night, certain villages remained awake longer than those farther south. Fishing schedules depended upon tides, moonlight, and the movement of fish through the waterways. Some boats departed again before midnight while others returned late carrying fresh catch to kitchens already preparing the next day's meals. The smell of fish never truly vanished from the delta. It lingered in baskets, in clothing, in boats drying beside the shore, in the walls of kitchens blackened by years of cooking. And through the quiet northern darkness, beneath the endless stars above ancient Egypt, the river spread outward toward the distant sea while the kitchens beside its waters continued breathing softly with smoke, steam, bread, and the patient rhythm of ordinary life. In the homes of scribes and temple record keepers, the kitchens carried quieter rhythms. These households were not rich like the great noble estates, yet they often lived more comfortably than ordinary laborers working in the fields or quarries. Scribes spent long hours bent over rolls of papyrus beneath shaded rooms, recording grain deliveries, tax accounts, temple inventories, and letters carried along the Nile. Their hands smelled more often of ink than stone dust. Still, their kitchens remained deeply tied to the same ancient routines as everyone else beside the river. Before sunrise, the fires were lit. The ovens warmed slowly. Grain was ground into flour. Smoke drifted upward into the fading darkness. Even in homes where reading and writing were respected skills, survival still depended on bread and water and fire. The kitchens of scribal households often smelled calmer because fewer people crowded into them. There was less shouting, less movement, fewer enormous meals prepared for large labor crews. Morning sounds remained gentle. The scrape of grinding stones. The soft bubbling of porridge. Papyrus brushes resting in nearby rooms while the household slowly awakened. Outside, narrow streets remained cool for a short while before sunrise. Temple bells or distant voices sometimes echoed faintly across the sleeping city while river breeze drifted through open windows carrying the familiar scent of wet mud and reeds. Inside the kitchens, women prepared modest meals beneath dim oil lamps. Bread baked quietly against clay oven walls. Beans simmered slowly in small blackened pots. Fresh herbs rested on woven mats beside onions and garlic. The smell was humble but steady. A life organized through routine. Scribes often worked close to temples or administrative buildings, and because of this, their kitchens sometimes sat near large sacred compounds where food offerings were prepared throughout the day. Temple kitchens had their own atmosphere entirely. They were cleaner than many ordinary household kitchens, though still filled with smoke and heat. Priests demanded careful preparation for offerings placed before the gods. Bread needed proper shaping. Fruit had to remain fresh. Meat was prepared with attention and ceremony. The smells drifting from temple kitchens could seem rich compared to ordinary homes nearby. Incense burning softly near the ovens. Honey warming in shallow bowls. Roasted duck and goose turning above carefully tended fires. Wine jars opened beside baskets of figs and dates. Yet behind the sacred rituals stood ordinary workers doing exhausting labor from dawn until night. Temple cooks rose early. Water carriers moved endlessly between the Nile and the storerooms. Servants swept floors darkened by years of ash and oil. The kitchen smelled sacred and practical at the same time. Frankincense drifting above fish scales. Perfumed oil beside sweating workers. Fresh bread cooling near piles of onion skins. Ancient Egypt rarely separated holiness from daily life. The gods themselves were believed to eat, drink, and receive nourishment through temple offerings. Kitchens therefore became part of the sacred order of the world. As daylight spread across the city, scribes left their homes carrying rolls of papyrus tucked carefully beneath their arms. Some paused briefly to eat bread dipped in oil before beginning long hours of writing. Others carried small meals with them wrapped in cloth. Their kitchens remained behind, still busy. Women cleaned bowls and grinding stones. Children carried water jars from public wells or riverbanks. Servants prepared midday meals while smoke drifted lazily through open courtyards. The smell of warm papyrus sometimes entered these kitchens too. Fresh papyrus sheets drying nearby released a faint green watery scent unlike anything else in Egypt. Mixed with smoke and grain, it created an atmosphere unique to households connected with writing and record keeping. By midday, the heat once again settled heavily over the city. Inside administrative buildings, Scribes worked slowly through the warmth while sweat gathered beneath their linen clothing. Reed pens scratched softly across papyrus as officials counted grain stores, tracked taxes, and recorded shipments arriving along the Nile. Nearby kitchens prepared the midday meal. Lentils simmered quietly. Bread warmed beside the ovens. Beer cooled in shaded jars dampened with water. The smell drifted gently through corridors and courtyards while workers rested briefly from their duties. Some temple kitchens also prepared food for the poor during religious festivals or special occasions. Long rows of bread might be distributed outside temple gates while crowds gathered beneath the sun. The smell of fresh loaves spreading through the streets could draw people from far across the city. Children waited patiently holding baskets. Older workers leaned wearily against walls while servants carried trays through the crowds. The kitchens behind these moments remained hot and exhausting despite the sacred purpose of the food. In quieter hours during late afternoon, certain scribal households became peaceful places. The strongest heat faded. Palm shadows stretched longer across courtyards. A light river breeze finally moved through the rooms again. Women prepared evening meals while older scribes returned home tired from hours spent over records and accounts. Their bodies may not have carried the same physical strain as quarry workers or farmers, but their exhaustion was real in different ways. Eyes burned from reading in dim light. Necks ached from leaning over papyrus. Hands cramped from endless writing. The kitchens welcomed them back just as warmly as they welcomed laborers from the fields. The smell of bread and onions softened the evening air. Oil lamps flickered beside shelves holding writing tools and scrolls. Children studied letters scratched onto broken pottery pieces while dinner cooked nearby. Some homes even kept small libraries of papyrus rolls stored carefully in wooden boxes or clay jars. These rooms smelled dry and dusty, filled with the faint scent of reeds and ink. When kitchen smoke drifted gently through the household, it mixed with these quieter scholarly smells. Outside, temple processions sometimes moved through the streets after sunset. Priests carried sacred statues beneath torchlight while incense drifted into the warm night air. Music echoed softly from drums and flutes. Crowds gathered respectfully along the roads while nearby kitchens paused briefly to watch. The smell of incense spread everywhere during these ceremonies. Frankincense, myrrh, burning resin carried upward into the dark sky. When it blended with ordinary cooking fires, the entire city seemed suspended between sacred ritual and daily survival. As night deepened, many scribes continued working by oil lamp inside quiet rooms while their kitchens slowly settled into silence. A final cup of beer rested beside scattered papyrus sheets. Leftover bread cooled on wooden trays. Ash dimmed gently beneath the ovens. The smells became soft and sleepy now. Warm clay. Cooling grain. A little smoke trap beneath the ceiling. Outside, the Nile reflected moonlight between dark temple walls and sleeping houses. Boats drifted silently along the river while distant dogs barked once or twice somewhere beyond the quiet streets. And throughout the ancient city, from grand temple compounds to humble scribal homes, the kitchens rested briefly beside the endless river, waiting patiently for the fires to awaken again before dawn. There were nights in ancient Egypt when the wind carried the smell of sand for many miles. It moved slowly out from the desert after sunset, brushing across the riverbanks and through the sleeping villages beside the Nile. Palm leaves rustled softly beneath the warm darkness. Fine dust drifted along narrow streets and settled quietly against doorways, baskets, rooftops, and cooking tools left outside to cool. Inside the kitchens, the sand found its way into everything eventually. Into flour bowls. Into jars of oil. Into fresh bread cooling beside the fire. Ancient Egyptians lived close to the desert even when surrounded by fertile land. The green valley of the Nile was narrow compared to the endless dry world beyond it. The kitchens therefore always carried traces of both worlds together. River and desert. Mud and dust. Water and fire. Before dawn, when most of the land still rested beneath the stars, the kitchen slowly began breathing once again. A woman rose quietly from her sleeping mat inside a small riverside home. The room remained dark except for faint moonlight entering through the doorway. Nearby, children slept beside folded blankets while old embers glowed weakly beneath a layer of ash. She knelt beside the oven and fed dry reeds into the coals. Soon the first smoke curled upward. The smell spread gently through the room. Warm ash waking after the night. Burning straw. Old smoke trapped inside the clay walls. Outside, the Nile moved silently in darkness. A fisherman carrying nets walked along the riverbank beneath the stars. Somewhere farther away, a donkey shifted against its rope beside a storage yard. The entire world felt quiet and slow. Inside the kitchen, grain was poured onto the grinding stone. The sound began softly. Stone against stone. Steady. Ancient. The smell of crushed grain rose into the air while the fire slowly strengthened nearby. Hands moved carefully through routines repeated since childhood. No rushing. No wasted movement. Every action shaped by years of practice. In wealthier times, enough grain filled the storage jars to last comfortably through the season. In poorer times, women measured carefully, worrying silently over how much remained before the next harvest. The kitchens often carried these worries invisibly. Thin soup simmering instead of thick stew. Smaller loaves cooling beside the ovens. Beer stretched weaker with more water. The smell of scarcity could settle quietly over a household without anyone speaking of it directly. Still, the fires continued each morning because they had to. As dawn approached, more kitchens awakened across the settlement. Smoke rose slowly from dozens of homes into the pale blue sky. The village began to smell alive again. Bread baking. Onions frying gently in oil. Beer poured into clay cups. Fish roasting over small fires near the river. Children woke to these smells every day of their lives. Elderly people fell asleep beside them after lifetimes spent hearing the crackle of reeds burning before sunrise. The kitchens shaped memory itself. Outside, the fields slowly brightened beneath early sunlight. Farmers walked toward irrigation canals carrying wooden hose across their shoulders. Their sandals pressed softly into damp soil while birds moved through the reeds nearby. Morning air remained cool for only a little while longer. Back inside the kitchens, the fires grew hotter. Sweat soon appeared along foreheads and necks despite the early hour. Cooking in ancient Egypt always demanded endurance because even simple meals required constant labor. Water needed carrying. Grain needed grinding. Fuel needed gathering. Nothing arrived easily. In some homes, older grandparents remained near the kitchens during the day while younger adults worked outside. They watched small children, repaired baskets, cleaned vegetables, or prepared herbs for evening meals. The kitchens became places where generations stayed close together. Stories drifted softly through the smoke. Children learned recipes simply by watching. Grandmothers corrected dough with tired, experienced hands. The smell of bread became tied to family itself. By midday, heat covered the valley once more. The sunlight pressed against mudbrick walls until the kitchens felt heavy and still. Even the flies moved more slowly through the thick warm air. Cooking fires deepened the exhaustion. Women stirred lentils carefully while sweat darkened their linen clothing. Clay jars cooled water as best they could in shaded corners. Cats stretched lazily near doorways avoiding direct sunlight. The smell of warm clay became strongest during these hours. Clay ovens. Clay bowls. Clay floors beneath bare feet. The entire kitchen seemed to radiate heat outward into the room. Sometimes the smell of cucumbers or melons briefly freshened the air during hotter months. Farmers growing crops near irrigation canals brought vegetables into the kitchens wrapped in damp cloth. Their cool watery scent contrasted beautifully against the smoke and dust. But freshness never lasted long beneath the Egyptian sun. Soon the familiar heavier smells returned again. Garlic, fish oil, ash, sweat. The kitchens carried the honest scent of hard living. Along the Nile itself, fishermen cleaned their catches during afternoon hours while boats rocked gently against muddy banks. Fish guts attracted birds circling overhead. Nets dried beneath the heat carrying the smell of river plants and algae. Nearby kitchens prepared the catch immediately whenever possible. Fresh fish crackled over open fires. Salt-coated wooden tables used for preservation. Oil hissed softly against heated clay pans. The smell drifted through riverside villages while workers returned home from the fields. As evening approached, the entire atmosphere softened. The heat slowly released its hold over the valley. Shadows lengthened across irrigation canals and palm groves. Dusty roads glowed orange beneath the lowering sun. This was the hour when many kitchens felt most beautiful. Firelight flickered against dark walls. Bread warmed slowly beside glowing coals. Steam rose from lentil stew into cooler air. Families gathered together after long exhausting days. The smell of the evening meal drifted gently between homes until entire villages seemed connected through smoke and grain and cooking oil. Some workers sat outside while eating, enjoying the first breeze of the day. Others remained indoors beside the warmth of the ovens while children leaned sleepily against their shoulders. The conversations during these evenings were likely quiet. People tired from labor rarely wasted energy on loudness. Instead there were soft voices. Small pauses. Comfortable silence broken only by the sounds of cooking fires and distant insects singing beside the river. Sometimes musicians passed through villages carrying simple flutes or drums. Their music drifted softly through the night while kitchens continued preparing meals behind open doorways. The smell of roasted onions lingered longest after dark. Sweet. Earthy. Warm. Mixed with bread and smoke, it created a scent that probably felt deeply comforting after a lifetime beside the Nile. Later, when the fires finally burned low, the kitchens entered their quietest hours. Ash settled softly. Clay walls released the heat they had stored all day. Oil lamps flickered beside sleeping mats while outside the stars brightened above the dark river. A few final smells remained awake in the darkness. Cooling bread. Old smoke trapped in blankets. Beer jars resting beside the walls. And beneath everything, faint but constant, the ancient scent of the Nile flowing patiently through the sleeping world beside the endless desert night. During harvest season, the kitchens of ancient Egypt became fuller than at any other time of year. The fields beside the Nile turned golden beneath the sun. Tall grain swayed gently in the warm wind while workers moved slowly through the crops carrying sickles with curved blades polished from long use. Dust rose around their feet. Birds circled overhead searching for fallen grain among the stubble. Everywhere, the smell of cut wheat filled the air. Dry. Warm. Almost sweet beneath the heat. The scent drifted from the fields directly into the villages where kitchens worked from before dawn until deep into the night. Harvest season brought relief after months of waiting and labor. It also brought enormous work. The grain had to be gathered carefully, stored safely, protected from insects, moisture, rats, and mold. Entire households became busy with preparation. Before sunrise, the villages were already awake. Cooking fires glowed behind mud-brick walls while workers prepared food to carry into the fields. Bread baked steadily inside hot ovens. Beer jars were sealed tightly for transport beneath the rising sun. Women packed onions, dried fish, and beans into woven baskets while children carried water jars toward waiting laborers. The kitchen smelled especially rich during these mornings. Fresh flour dust floated through the air. Warm loaves cooled beside the fires. Roasted grain crackled gently in shallow pans. Compared to leaner seasons, the scent carried a feeling of abundance now. Outside, harvest workers walked into the fields while the eastern sky slowly brightened from deep blue to pale gold. Their sandals brushed against dry earth and fallen stalks. The sound of cutting grain spread softly across the valley. Thousands of small scraping motions together. Steady. Rhythmic. Almost peaceful from a distance. Back inside the kitchens, the work never slowed. Fresh grain arrived constantly from the fields. Women and servants cleaned it carefully, removing chaff and dirt before storage. The smell of raw grain became powerful inside these homes. Dusty. Nutty. Earthy and dry. Storage rooms filled with it. Baskets overflowed with it. Even the workers' skin carried traces of grain dust after long days handling the harvest. Some kitchens attached to larger farming estates became incredibly busy during these weeks. Dozens of laborers needed feeding every day. Massive ovens baked loaf after loaf without rest. Brewers prepared huge quantities of beer from newly harvested grain while servants moved endlessly between storerooms and cooking fires. The air inside these kitchens felt thick with heat and flour. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Ash coated the floors. The smell of yeast rose heavily from fermenting dough. Yet there was satisfaction hidden inside the exhaustion. A successful harvest meant survival through the coming seasons. It meant fuller meals, stronger beer, greater security for families who had worried quietly through difficult months. The kitchens reflected this emotional change in subtle ways. Meals became slightly larger, bread softer and fresher, beer richer. Sometimes dates or honey appeared more often beside ordinary meals. Children likely sensed the difference immediately through smell alone. Fresh bread straight from harvest grain carried warmth and life inside it. The loaves felt heavier and softer in the hands. Steam escaped gently when broken open beside the evening fire. As the sun climbed higher, the harvest fields grew brutally hot. Workers bent for hours cutting grain beneath endless light reflected from dry soil. Sweat soaked through linen. Dust clung to damp skin. Water carriers moved constantly between fields and kitchens trying to keep laborers from collapsing in the heat. Midday meals were often eaten quickly beneath whatever shade could be found. Palm trees. Mud walls. Temporary shelters made from reeds. Bread passed from hand to hand. Beer poured carefully into shared cups. Onions peeled slowly by tired fingers. The smell of crushed grain remained everywhere because harvest surrounded the entire landscape. Even the wind carried it through the villages and canals. Inside the kitchens during these hot hours, women continued grinding flour despite the heat. The grinding stones never rested long during harvest season. Their sound echoed through the settlements almost continuously. Stone against stone. Dust rising through shafts of sunlight. Children coughing softly through flour-filled air. The labor damaged bodies over time. Many older women carried permanent pain in their backs, shoulders, and knees from decades spent preparing grain. Fine flour dust entered lungs daily. Teeth wore down from gritty bread filled with traces of sand and stone. Yet still the kitchens remained centers of warmth and care despite the physical hardship. An elderly woman shaping dough carefully for grandchildren. A mother blowing gently across a child's hot soup. A tired worker returning from the fields to the smell of fresh bread after sunset. These moments gave meaning to exhausting labor. Toward evening, harvest villages became especially beautiful. Golden light rested across stacks of gathered grain. Boats moved slowly along the Nile carrying harvest supplies toward larger storehouses and cities. The air cooled little by little while smoke rose gently from cooking fires across the valley. The kitchens awakened fully once more. Fresh grain inspired fuller evening meals whenever possible. Stew simmered richly in blackened clay pots. Bread baked continuously beside glowing ovens. Herbs crushed into sauces released sharp green scents into the smoky air. Sometimes families roasted ducks or geese during successful harvest celebrations. The smell drifted through entire villages while neighbors gathered together beneath the darkening sky. Laughter likely came more easily during these evenings. Children played longer before sleep. Workers rested with slightly lighter hearts. The kitchens glowed warmly against the night. Inside larger homes, servants worked late preparing grain for long-term storage. Scribes carefully recorded harvest amounts on papyrus while officials inspected supplies destined for temples, royal warehouses, or labor crews attached to massive building projects. The entire kingdom depended on these harvests. Without grain, Egypt weakened. Without kitchens, grain remained useless. Everything flowed together through labor and fire and river water. Temple kitchens became especially active during harvest festivals. Offerings of fresh bread, beer, fruit, and roasted meats filled sacred spaces with rich comforting smells. Priests thanked the gods for the flooding of the Nile and the renewal of the land. Incense drifted upward beside the smell of newly baked bread. Frankincense and grain smoked together. Sacred and ordinary at once. Crowds gathered near temple courtyards while musicians played softly beneath torchlight. Families carried small offerings from their own kitchens into the sacred grounds. Even in worship, the scent of food remained central to life. Late into the night, many kitchens continued working beneath oil lamps. Fresh grain needed grinding. Dough needed preparing for dawn. Storage jars required sealing before moisture or pests ruined precious supplies. The smell of warm flour lingered heavily in the darkness. Outside, the Nile reflected moonlight between silent fields stripped clean after harvest. Palm trees swayed gently in the warm wind while distant insects hummed beside irrigation canals. And throughout the ancient valley, from humble farming homes to grand temple storehouses, the kitchens continued breathing softly through the night, carrying the scent of bread, grain, smoke, and human endurance beneath the endless Egyptian stars. When illness entered a household beside the Nile, the kitchens changed their rhythm immediately. The fires still burned. Bread still baked. Water still needed carrying from the river. But everything became quieter. Voices softened inside the rooms. Footsteps slowed across the packed earth floors. Even the smell of cooking seemed gentler somehow, as though the kitchens themselves understood that someone nearby was weak and resting. In ancient Egypt, sickness was a familiar part of life. The river brought fertility, but it also carried disease. Heat spoiled food quickly. Insects spread illness through crowded villages and cities. Smoke from cooking fires damaged lungs over many years. Hard labor weakened bodies long before old age arrived. Most families knew sickness closely. And when fever came, the kitchen became a place of care as much as survival. Before dawn, a woman might wake quietly beside a sick child resting under thin linen cloth. The room would still be dark except for faint starlight entering through the doorway. Nearby, the cooking fire waited beneath cold ash. She would kneel carefully and begin building the morning flame. Dry reeds crackling softly. Smoke rising slowly through the silence. The smell spread through the room with familiar warmth. Old ash. Burning straw. Clay warmed by fire again after the cool night. For healthy workers, the morning meal needed strength and fullness. But during illness, the kitchens prepared softer foods. Thin porridge. Warm broth. Crushed herbs mixed gently into liquids. The smell became lighter. Less roasted fish. Less frying oil. More simmering grain and medicinal plants. Ancient Egyptians used many herbs and natural remedies inside their homes. Garlic remained especially valued because people believed it protected health and restored strength. Mint, coriander, cumin, and other plants were crushed into mixtures meant to ease pain or settle the stomach. The kitchen smelled strongly of herbs during these times. Fresh green scents rising above smoke and warm clay. Some healers prepared oils and salves inside the household kitchens themselves. Animal fat melted slowly over small fires while herbs steeped inside bowls nearby. Resin and incense occasionally burned beside sleeping mats to purify the air or comfort the sick. The smell of incense during illness carried a quiet sadness. Frankincense drifting softly through dim rooms. Myrrh warming beside oil lamps late at night. The scent mixed with smoke and medicine and human exhaustion. Outside, village life continued as always. Farmers still walked toward the fields before sunrise. Boats still moved across the Nile. Children still carried water jars through dusty streets. But inside sick households, time seemed slower. Meals took longer to prepare because energy felt precious. Conversations paused often. Families listened carefully for changes in breathing from the sleeping room nearby. The kitchens became places of waiting. A mother stirring broth while listening silently. An old grandmother grinding herbs beneath weak lamplight. A child carrying cool water from the river for an exhausted parent. The smell of boiling water became common during fever. Steam rising gently into smoky air. Cloths warmed beside the fire. Clay cups filled and refilled beside sleeping mats. Sometimes sickness lasted only a few days. Strength slowly returned. The household brightened again. The kitchen smells deepened back into ordinary life. Fresh bread. Roasting onions. Fish crackling over flames. But sometimes illness remained much longer. In crowded workers' villages, disease could spread quickly between homes standing close together. Smoke-filled rooms with poor ventilation weakened lungs. Flies gathered near food and waste. Clean water was never guaranteed. The kitchens witnessed all of this quietly. Some homes lost appetite entirely during hard times. Bread sat untouched beside cooling fires. Beer jars remained fuller than usual. The smell of stale food carried a different sadness than the smell of fresh cooking. Still, the kitchens continued trying to nourish life. In wealthier households, sick family members sometimes received special foods thought to restore strength. Honey sweetened warm drinks. Fresh fruit appeared beside sleeping mats. Tender roasted bird meat replaced rough laborers' bread. The richer kitchens smelled softer during illness. Warm honey. Sweet figs. Mild broth simmering slowly. Servants moved carefully through shaded rooms while healers examined the sick by oil lamp or sunlight entering through courtyards. Yet even wealthy homes feared sickness deeply because medicine in the ancient world remained uncertain. A simple fever could become dangerous. An infected wound could end a life quietly. The kitchens therefore became emotional centers during illness, holding families together through routine and care. Temple healers also prepared remedies inside sacred compounds near the great kitchens that supplied offerings to the gods. Priests believed certain illnesses carried spiritual meaning as well as physical causes. Sacred oils, herbs, prayers, and food all mixed together in treatment. Temple kitchens smelled especially powerful during healing rituals. Burning incense. Medicinal herbs crushed carefully into mixtures. Bread and beer prepared as offerings. The scent drifted through stone halls beneath torchlight while prayers echoed softly nearby. Ordinary people often hoped the gods would notice these offerings and restore health to the suffering. As evening approached inside sick households, the kitchens became quieter still. The day's labor had ended outside. Workers returned home carrying dust and fatigue from the fields or riverbanks. But homes touched by illness remained subdued even during the evening meal. Fires glowed low. Soup simmered gently. Voices stayed soft beside sleeping children or elderly parents. The smell of onions cooking slowly in broth often filled these rooms because onions lasted well and flavored simple healing meals. Garlic too remained common. Its strong scent drifted through entire homes long after dinner ended. Outside, neighbors sometimes sent food quietly to sick families. Fresh bread left near the doorway. A little fish wrapped in cloth. Extra herbs gathered near irrigation canals. The kitchens of ancient Egypt were deeply connected to community. Hunger and illness rarely stayed hidden from nearby homes for long. As darkness deepened beside the Nile, oil lamps flickered against mud-brick walls while caregivers remained awake beside the sick. Some sat near the kitchen fire through the night preparing warm drinks or cooling cloths. The smell of smoke lingered gently in their clothing while insects hummed outside in the warm darkness. The Nile moved silently nearby beneath the moon. Boats drifted softly against their ropes. Palm leaves whispered in the night breeze. Inside the homes, the kitchens breathed quietly beside human suffering and tenderness alike. A little steam rising from broth. Cooling bread untouched on the table. Herbs drying beside the walls. Ash settling slowly beneath fading embers. And through the long ancient night, while the river flowed endlessly beside the sleeping valley, the kitchens remained awake with soft firelight, warm clay, and the patient hope that morning might bring healing once again. There were also kitchens in ancient Egypt that belonged to people who spent much of their lives traveling. Boatmen. River traders. Messengers carrying letters between cities. Workers guiding heavy cargo along the Nile. These people rarely remained in one home for very long. Their lives moved with the river itself, drifting between villages, temple docks, marsh settlements, and crowded cities beneath the endless Egyptian sky. And wherever they traveled, the smell of kitchens followed them. Before sunrise, the river docks were already awake. The Nile looked dark and smooth beneath fading stars while narrow wooden boats rocked gently against muddy banks. Ropes creaked softly. Water touched the shore with quiet patient sounds. Small fires glowed near the dockside shelters where travelers prepared simple meals before departure. The smell there was different from village kitchens. Damp wood. Wet rope. Fish scales. Smoke carried low over the water. Boatmen often slept close beside their cargo beneath rough-woven blankets. Their clothing carried the scent of the river constantly. Mud from the banks dried onto their sandals. Their hands smelled of wet reeds, fish oil, and sun-warmed wood. Before pushing away from shore, they ate quickly. Bread hardened slightly from the night air. Onions peeled beside dim firelight. Beer poured carefully into cups while the world remained mostly silent. The kitchens along the docks were small but busy. Clay ovens warmed slowly while cooks prepared food for travelers leaving before dawn. Fresh loaves baked beside baskets of dried fish and jars of dates meant for journeys farther south or north along the river. The smell of baking bread mixed beautifully with the cool river air. Mist sometimes drifted above the Nile during the early morning. Through this pale haze, smoke rose from riverside kitchens all along the banks. The entire river valley seemed to awaken through scent before sunlight fully arrived. As dawn spread across the water, the boats departed one by one. Long poles pushed against the muddy bottom near shore. Sails slowly lifted when the wind allowed. The kitchens behind them continued breathing softly while the travelers drifted farther along the Nile. Life aboard river boats carried its own smells. Cargo boats transporting grain often smelled dry and dusty beneath the heat. Grain sacks released warm earthy scents while rats sometimes hid among the supplies. Boats carrying fish smelled sharply of salt and river water. Merchant boats transporting oils, incense, papyrus, or wine carried richer aromas drifting across the docks whenever they arrived. Some larger boats even held tiny cooking spaces on board. Simple fires burned carefully inside clay containers to prepare meals during long journeys. The smell of smoke trailing behind a boat across calm morning water must have felt strangely comforting to travelers far from home. Bread warmed over small flames. Fish roasted carefully above glowing coals. Water boiling slowly inside blackened pots. The Nile carried these kitchen smells endlessly between settlements. At midday, river travel became exhausting beneath the sun. Light reflected harshly from the water until eyes burned from brightness. Boatmen wrapped cloth around their heads while sweat soaked through linen clothing. Some boats drifted toward shaded banks where crews rested briefly beneath palm trees or reed shelters. Temporary riverside kitchens appeared during these pauses. Small cooking fires crackled near the shore. Clay jars cooled in damp mud. Fish cleaned beside the water's edge. The smell of river plants mixed with smoke and hot sand beneath the blazing sky. Travelers from distant regions often exchanged food along the Nile. A boatman from the delta might carry dried fish southward while receiving grain or beer in return. Merchants brought unfamiliar oils or spices into local kitchens where cooks experimented carefully with new flavors and scents. Most ordinary Egyptians still ate simple meals, but the river slowly connected different food traditions together. The kitchens beside major river ports became especially lively because of this constant movement. Voices from distant towns echoed through crowded dock markets. Foreign traders unloaded goods beside Egyptian workers. Smoke drifted upward from food stalls serving hungry travelers arriving after long journeys. The smells layered together endlessly. Fresh bread. Roasting fish. Beer foam spilling onto wooden tables. Incense from merchant cargo. Wet river mud drying beneath the heat. These dockside kitchens rarely rested. Even late into the night, travelers still arrived searching for food and warmth before sleeping beside the river. Some inns and resting houses prepared meals continuously for passing merchants and officials. Their kitchens smelled heavy from constant use. Old smoke trapped inside low ceilings. Oil soaked into wooden counters. Clay ovens radiating heat long after sunset. Servants moved through the darkness carrying bowls of stew and fresh loaves while tired travelers spoke quietly nearby. For people living on the river, kitchens often became temporary homes. A familiar smell of bread after weeks of travel could stir deep emotions. The scent of onions frying in oil might remind a boatman of his family village far upriver. Fresh beer poured beside a warm fire could ease loneliness after days drifting across silent water. The kitchens connected travelers back to ordinary life. As evening approached along the Nile, the river became softer and more beautiful. The fierce sunlight faded into gold across the water. Birds settled among reeds near the banks. Boats drifted more slowly while smoke from evening kitchens rose gently into the cooling air. Families waiting beside riverside homes watched for returning boats. Children stood barefoot near the shore. Women prepared meals while listening for familiar voices outside. The smell of dinner drifted warmly through the twilight. Fish roasting over open fires. Lentils simmering slowly. Fresh herbs crushed into sauces. Warm bread cooling beside clay jars of water. When travelers finally stepped ashore after long journeys, these kitchen smells welcomed them home before words were even spoken. Inside the homes, evening meals stretched peacefully into darkness. Stories from distant towns drifted through the rooms while oil lamps flickered softly against smoke-darkened walls. Boatmen described storms farther south or crowded ports near the delta. Merchants spoke of strange cargoes or temple festivals seen during their travels. Meanwhile, the kitchens continued their quiet work around them. More bread warming near the fire. Beer poured into waiting cups. Fish bones cleared gently from the floor for the cats waiting nearby. Outside, the Nile reflected moonlight beneath silent palm trees. Boats rocked softly against wooden posts while insects hummed through the warm night air. And all along the ancient river, from quiet fishing villages to busy trading docks, the kitchens glowed softly beside the water, filling the darkness with smoke, bread, river air, and the comforting scent of lives forever moving with the endless flow of the Nile. Now the fires beside the Nile are growing quiet. The ovens that glowed through the long ancient night have begun to cool beneath soft layers of ash. Bread rests untouched on wooden tables. Clay jars stand silently against the walls. The smell of smoke still lingers gently in the dark rooms, woven deeply into linen blankets, baskets of grain, and the old mud-brick homes resting beneath the stars. Outside, the river continues its slow endless journey through Egypt. Black water moves softly beneath moonlight. Reeds sway in the warm night breeze. Far away, a fishing boat drifts quietly along the shore while sleepy birds settle among the marshes. The workers are asleep now. The bakers who woke before dawn. The women grinding grain beside flickering lamps. The fishermen carrying wet nets through morning mist. The stone workers returning home coated in dust and heat. Their kitchens have finally gone still. Only faint embers glow beneath the ash. A little warmth remains inside the clay walls. And floating softly through the quiet darkness is the scent that stayed with ancient Egypt through every season of life. Warm bread. River water. Smoke. Garlic and onions. Fish drying beside the Nile. Fresh grain resting after harvest. The smell of ordinary people surviving gently beneath the desert sky. Not kings. Not monuments. Not golden treasures hidden beneath stone. Just quiet homes beside the river. Families gathering after long days beneath the sun. Small fires glowing against the night. Simple meals prepared by tired hands. And somewhere beyond the sleeping villages, the great Nile continues flowing patiently through the darkness, just as it did thousands of years ago. The stars remain above the valley. The warm wind still moves across the water. And the ancient kitchens slowly fade into silence beside the endless river night.